Good evening, everybody, and you're all very welcome to a fresh season of Tras and the Tira this evening. I'm delighted to be joined by Martin O'Donoghue. Martin lectures in modern Irish and British history at the University of Sheffield, and his book, The Legacy of the Irish Parliamentary Party in Independent Ireland, 1922 to 1949, is published by Liverpool University Press. He joins us to talk about his book this evening, and his book sheds a new light on the legacy of people like Charles Stewart Parnell, John Redmond and Michael Davitt. Martin, you're very, very welcome to Tras na Tíre.
Thank you very much, Liam, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I'm very glad to be able to talk tonight about Home Rulers and the birth of the Free State and looking at the legacy of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Drawing on my book, The Legacy of the Irish Parliamentary Party in Independent Ireland, which was published by Liverpool University Press and happily is out in paperback this month at a more reasonable price than the hardback. So what I want to talk about tonight is individuals who were in the Irish Parliamentary Party, who were in the campaign for Home Rule, individuals who supported the Irish Party, and their family members and the organisations that were part of the national movement for Home Rule and how they adapted to the changed circumstances of the Irish Free State, which came into being in 1922, and the changes that were brought about in the years which followed. So to begin, I want to look at James Dillon, a former leader of Fine Gael, son of the last Irish Party leader, and a grandson of a young Irelander. And in his retirement, he reflected on his life in politics, and he wrote, quote, "The old Irish Party spoke to all appearances for a united nation, and it was generally believed in that period between 1914 and 1916 that the fight was over, that we had won." Now, there are many points we might raise in response to Dillon's reflections after his life in politics. One is the use of "we" to refer to the Home Rule movement in 1914, when James Dillon himself would only have been 12 years of age at the time. But probably the most noteworthy would be how wrong his quote appeared in retrospect. Opponents of the Irish Party did exist prior to 1916, and the question of Irish unity in any Home Rule Ireland was certainly not settled in that period. But to Dillon and to many others who were loyal to the party, they did feel they were almost there before the First World War. And this was certainly a narrative that they told in the years afterwards. Dillon cherished the memory of the Irish Party. He retained an interest in its history and a belief in its achievements throughout a long and colourful career in independent Ireland. However, in order to reach the high points of his political career, James Dillon, as government minister, as leader of the opposition, he had to embrace the traditions and the structures of a political culture that was in some ways alien to that which many had envisaged in 1914. He had to join a party derived from Sinn Féin. He had to work with those who had been in the IRA during the War of Independence. He was a politician in a 26-county free state and later republic, not a Home Rule polity. He represented a state which honoured the rebels of Easter week, much more so than it marked the leaders of the Home Rule struggle. He also served as a politician in a state with a tricolour as its flag, rather than the old green flag of Home Rule, a state which had the soldier song as its anthem, rather than A Nation Once Again, or even God Save Ireland, the songs that were associated with the Home Rule movement. Now, Dillon was hardly a politician happy to bite his tongue, and such accommodations highlighted his distinctive background. Yet, while he was distinctive, he was not alone. Individual personalities always shape political careers, but Dillon was far from the only one who might consider themselves a Home Ruler or an old Irish Party supporter in independent Ireland, as this paper will show. Some, of course, found accommodation easier than others. The historian Dave Fitzpatrick talked about the transition from Home Rule to Sinn Féin at local level as the process of decanting old wine into new bottles. But as this paper will also demonstrate, others like Dillon found it hard to turn aside older political loyalties and labels. Yet, after 1922, Home Rulers entered politics, they joined and formed parties, they entered conversations about history, they debated the constitutional status of the state and Ireland's place in the wider world. So what I'm going to talk about over the next 40 minutes or so is an exploration of the attitudes of such individuals, how they accommodated themselves to the new state, political ideas they expressed, and how they analysed the relationship with Britain and the nature of Irish sovereignty. It's important to note to begin with that although the Irish Party was seemingly destroyed at the 1918 election, it still maintained a strong level of support. Some constituencies weren't contested, but in the ones that were, they attracted about 224,000 voters nationally. Now, some of this can be accounted for perhaps by an electoral pact in constituencies in Ulster, where Sinn Féin and the Irish Party agreed not to split the nationalist vote. But even so, if we were to take a percentage vote of what the Irish Party got in 1918 on an all-Ireland basis, percentage-wise, it's similar to the first preference vote that Fine Gael achieved at its lowest point in the 1940s and that Fianna Fáil achieved in 2011. However, circumstances were obviously very different. There was a first-past-the-post system for a Westminster election, which meant that the Irish Party only won 6 seats on an all-Ireland basis. But there was also the fact that Sinn Féin had presented itself as a voice of nationalism in an era of self-determination, that Sinn Féin wasn't going to attend Westminster, was going to set up Dáil Éireann, and the violence then that soon engulfed the country meant that the Irish Party, with a lot of older politicians from the era of Charles Stewart Parnell, took a back seat and seemingly disintegrated. But again, loyalty was strongest in Ulster, and the Nationalist Party in Northern Ireland, aided by the Eighth Order of Hibernians, Catholic fraternal body, and the leadership of individuals like James Dillon, for example, or like James Dillon mentioned, but Joe Devlin in Northern Ireland, were people who were in a position to take a leading role in nationalist politics in Northern Ireland. Politics in Northern Ireland was, of course, a frustrating political experience for nationalists. They didn't take their seats in the Belfast Parliament until 1925. Yet despite this, and divisions among Northern nationalists, the survival of a nationalist party represented a legacy of the Irish Party in Northern Ireland in adverse circumstances. South of the border, those who still held Home Rule loyalties found themselves in a self-governed independent state led by nationalists. But it was a free state, and it wasn't led by those who'd been in the Irish Party, but it was led by those who had been part of the Sinn Féin movement. The great majority of Home Rulers who had not defected to Sinn Féin in 1918 accepted the treaty settlement, but they were not necessarily the treatyites that the Commonwealth Party would have liked them to be. Self-government became a reality, but it was with W.T. Cosgrave's party leading, and it was W.T. Cosgrave's party holding power, while many in Sinn Féin, who opposed the treaty, didn't take their seats in Dáil Éireann in the early years. Years had passed since the defeat of the Irish Parliamentary Party, and for those with continued sympathies, a period of adjustment to the new constellation was necessary. There were obviously obvious changes on the surface. I've mentioned the flag, I've mentioned the anthem. The old image of Irish self-government in the era when the Home Rule movement was in its pomp was College Green and Grattan's Parliament. However, the new Parliament of the Free State took its place temporarily at first and later permanently in Leinster House. Some of these trappings of the new state were done without major pomp and ceremony. If you look at the adoption of the Soldier's Song as the anthem, the Free State government of Commonwealth is quite slow to make an official announcement about what the anthem of the Free State is to be. But most old nationalists seem to have accepted these symbols without much complaint. In later life, James Dillon always said that he associated the Soldier's Song with Easter Week in 1916, and similarly the tricolour, but most old nationalists, as they became known in the 1920s, accepted them without too much public complaint. At a representative level, however, political loyalties were often more difficult to turn aside. And former Home Rule politicians began to emerge in the early 1920s, sometimes providing defiant examples of the older tradition in the new state. One of the examples would be Captain William Redmond, on the slide here, pictured in his British Army uniform, a war veteran, son of the late Irish Party leader John Redmond, who stood in Waterford in 1923, turning down an invitation by Cumann na Gael to stand for that party. Another is Alfie Byrne, who won a seat in Dublin as an independent, seen here in his mayoral garb, and somebody who would later be known to generations as the shaking hand of Dublin and was elected mayor of Dublin 10 times. Redmond stood as an independent. He drew in a lot of Redmondite support in Waterford, and he didn't exactly clarify whether he was an official treaty candidate or not, running in August 1923. He said he supported the treaty without being in ecstasies about it. in terms of gauging what his views on the settlement were, he was somewhat elusive, but he did look at the idea of getting back to peace after the violence of previous years and gestured towards the Commonwealth network as an avenue to which the Free State could participate. So for instance, he said in one speech that he called on everyone to try to work for the new state in order that they may persuade their fellow countrymen in the 6 counties to join them. He declared in another speech that he had no faith in the Boundary Commission, set up to adjudicate on the boundary between the Northern Ireland and the Free State, and looked to Commonwealth countries like South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand as what he called the freest democracies in the world. Others like Byrne, a lot of the time, re-entered politics or were re-elected on the basis of local appeal. And this itself was actually a legacy of the Irish Party. The Irish Party had built on pre-existing democratic traditions, of course, but it gave a defining character and form of organisation around a party with constituency branches. And as James McConnell's work on backbench MPs has illustrated, a deeply entrenched practice of brokerage, which predated independence. So in this way, I think we can say that localism was not simply a product of independence or even a product of multi-seat constituencies and proportional representation. It was also easier for individuals who had been only involved at the local level or had taken lesser roles in the wider Home Rule movement to often reinvent themselves in new parties. For example, while the Home Rule movement was dominant in most areas prior to the First World War, in Munster, William O'Brien's All for Ireland League could be described as a dissident Home Rule organisation that had very much was at odds with the party, with Redmond's party. And some individuals who were active in that at a local level and in the Irish Land and Labour Association found their way into the Labour Party in the Free State. And the coming of independence saw the expansion of parliamentary representation. There were more seats in Dáil Éireann than there had ever been available for Irish constituencies in Westminster. And this saw, to a certain extent, local politicians gaining an opportunity to graduate to a National Assembly. Others who could be said to have been involved in the Home Rule movement in one way or another were those involved in agrarian movements around the country. And the connection between land and politics didn't disappear with the Irish Party. In the early 1920s, there were individuals who had been prominent in politics at local level in the era of the Home Rule Party, found themselves in the Farmers' Party, a group which originated as a political wing of the Irish Farmers' Union. Despite the legacies of the Land League and successor organisations, the Irish Farming Union was by no means essentially a Home Rule organisation. It contained members who were unionist in political sympathies, those who were Home Rule supporters, and those who were Sinn Féin. But in the Free State, it became the driver of the Farmers' Party. It was an organisation that promoted the rights of farmers. Its membership has generally been seen to have been larger farmers, and some of these were people who had previously benefited, or their parents' generation had previously benefited from land legislation won by the old Irish Party. 3 of the 7 farmer deputies returned to the Dáil in 1922 had previously been councillors at local level or poor law guardians. In August 1923, the Farmers' Party won 15 TDs. One of them was an ex-Irish Party candidate for a Westminster election, and 5 had been councillors. And as Tony Varley has noted, the connection, therefore, that the Irish Party had had with organisations like the United Irish League and previous agrarian organisations was carried through, although we should also note that it was carried through in some ways in the sense that a lot of farmers would later vote for Cumann na Gael or Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil as well. And there's a dimension of brokerage, of course, included when we talk about the appeal of both of these parties to farming communities. In fact, looking at the picture of politics in the Free State more broadly, it's been argued that constitutional nationalism was already alive and well in the Free State, as Ciara Meehan has done, under the guardianship of the new government. How did old nationalists react to Cumann na Gael taking over government and effectively being a constitutional nationalist party, albeit in very changed circumstances with self-government achieved and a parliament in Dublin? Some old nationalists were willing to accept Cumann na Gael and support them. Many of them saw them as the least bad option in comparison to the anti-treatyites and wanted a restoration of peace and order. Others grumbled that Cumann na Gael might be ex-Sinn Féiners who were only coming to realise then what they had realized in 1918 or 1916, that a republic might be desirable but was not possible, and that it was preferable to an unwinnable war with England. Another historian, John M. Regan, of course, has presented the idea of the Irish counter-revolution in this period. And he's looked at the absorption of former Irish Party followers, along with Unionists, into an increasingly middle-class conservative Cumann na Gael in the 1920s. It didn't always follow, however, that all treatyites, well, they may have been conservative, were closet home rulers, and didn't follow that former home rulers always found themselves easily accommodated in the new governing party. And part of this is down to how they perceived the changes of the years before independence, and part of it is down to the broad-based nature of the old Home Rule movement and the difficulty in pinning down perhaps what the Home Rule movement had stood for, apart from Home Rule for Ireland and its commitment to land reform. Cumann na Gael, after all, remained a Sinn Féin party. Cosgrave was a 1916 veteran. As Jason Kinnerk has argued, there was a distinction between treatyite commitment to the Commonwealth as an anti-imperial instrument and John Redmond's conception of being part of the empire's core. Of course, the Home Rule movement also changed emphases under different leaders and in different generations. Redmond as leader did speak about Ireland taking its role in the empire. Well, as other scholars like Paul Townend have shown, in the leadership of Charles Stewart Parnell, anti-imperialism was visible among many Home Rule speakers and activists. In its original iteration under Isaac Butt spoke of federalism. And it is the case, looking at the 1920s, that if many Home Rulers had been offered a settlement along the lines of the treaty for a united Ireland in 1914, it seems sure that they would have accepted it. But the means by which it was achieved, what they perceived as the denigration of the memory of Redmond and the Irish Party, and the ongoing issue of the border, offended many of them and led to a certain amount of disenchantment among some old Home Rulers for both the Free State government and for the Republicans. In personnel, in fact, the treatyites garnered some converts from the Home Rule movement initially, but not a huge number. Some may have joined after the Rising, some may have joined in 1918, but there were still others who held aloof. As a starting point, Tim Healy, and Home Rule MP, perhaps best known for the stand he took against Parnell at the time of the Parnell split, he was appointed Governor General of the Free State. In some ways, perhaps the perfect blend of acknowledgement for and independence from the Irish Party. It was a nod to the older political tradition, but it was also could be seen as a barb to his old parliamentary rival, John Dillon. John Dillon, as the last Irish Party leader, was retired in the Free State period, and he lived until 1927, but he never reconciled himself to the Free State. He did not re-enter politics. He did make some noteworthy public appearances. He addressed a John Redmond commemoration in Wexford in 1924, addressing 20,000 people, a lot of old Home Rule followers and those who still retained loyalty to the movement. And Dillon was scathing in his criticism of the Free State government on that particular occasion. But he never re-entered politics. By contrast, his old adversary, Healy, revelled in the new position. He was somebody from the Dominion, which was unusual and was not wholly welcomed by the British government, but he was proposed by his nephew-in-law, Kevin O'Higgins. Yet O'Higgins was from a similar background to many of those prominent in Home Rule politics, and his brother had served in the First World War. Kevin O'Higgins himself had been quite critical of John Redmond during the First World War, and in 1918 had written that while he was not a doctrinaire Republican, he was committed to more than Home Rule and accepted the doctrine entirely of Sinn Féin. For people like O'Higgins and others in Cumann na Gael, Home Rulers, whether they were still standing outside of politics or whether they had joined the ranks of the independent deputies or the Farmers' Party, appeared more obvious avenues of support than Republicans, and many began to drift into the party from 1923 onwards. A noteworthy example, perhaps, there is Henry Harrison, seen opposite one of the early Free State stamps, which you see is marked, is basically an old stamp from the era of British rule with Searstad Éireann or Free State 1922 printed over it. Harrison's an interesting one because many of these old Home Rulers in the Free State period are individuals who were prominent or who were active in the Home Rule movement in the era of John Redmond's leadership coming up to the First World War. Harrison was somewhat different in that he was very, very close to Parnell. He was an MP in the period of Parnell's leadership, and he had been his close confidant and secretary, but he had left politics after that, but had served in the First World War. And Harrison was a Protestant Home Ruler from Holywood, County Down, who offered analyses of political and economic questions facing the Free State in a weekly newspaper that he ran and edited, memorably titled Irish Truth. And for Harrison, the treaty settlement and the Boundary Commission was crucial. He interpreted Article 12 of the treaty as meaning that Northern Ireland could only proceed to self-government with the consent of the Free State. And he initially joined Cumann and in some ways he was seen as an asset, editing his own weekly newspaper. But the debacle of the Boundary Commission, where the border remained unchanged and seemed to in fact be copper fastened, this shattered Harrison's belief that unity could be brought about in the short term. And he would find common cause with Captain William Redmond, who I've mentioned already, and another ex-MP, the former MP for West Kerry, Thomas O'Donnell. And in their alliance, we see the birth of the Irish National League in 1926. The Irish National League is interesting in terms of how Home Rulers respond to the Free State, because it actually demonstrates that many of them were not reconciled at all, because it was an effort to revive the old Irish Party in the Free State. And what we see here is Home Rulers seeking to plot a middle way between both sides of the treaty civil war split. It was made up chiefly of former Irish Party activists and politicians. It drew on sustained Redmondite loyalty in the southeast. It also drew on loyalty and significant membership of the age-sort of Hibernians in border counties, though Joe Devlin, if you like, the most prominent nationalist politician in Northern Ireland, someone with a Home Rule background, decided not to enter Free State politics, and some Hibernians in the south remained aloof. The League signified, therefore, that loyalty to the Irish Party remained. But what did these Home Rulers actually want? The League criticised Cumann said that public expenditure was out of control. It called for an end to partition. And it polled best where the old Irish Party had got support best in 1918. And it reused a lot of Irish Party symbols and nomenclature. So at some of its meetings, you would see the green flag with the gold harp rather than the tricolour. The Irish National League itself, as a name, called to mind the movement of Parnell. And as you can see here on the next slide, it ran 30 candidates in the June 1927 election. 9 of them were ex-MPs. 11 had been councillors or poor law guardians, or 12, I should say, were councillors or poor law guardians. 2 of the National League's candidates had been candidates for the Irish Party for Westminster. So there's a very significant overlap here between the League's candidates and people who are involved in the old party. I've also on a second table there examples of where the National League polled best in June 1927. It won 8 seats, those in bold are marked. And it got its best result in Louth, where the Irish Party had only narrowly actually lost out to Sinn Féin in 1918, in Waterford with Redmond, who had held a seat in 1918, in Wexford, where the Irish Party had narrowly lost out on winning a seat in 1918. It also did quite well in Dublin South, Cork Borough, Donegal, and the Irish Party had a seat in Donegal in 1918. And in Galway, despite only getting 10.83% of the vote, although proportional representation was in multi-seat constituencies in the Free State era, involved very large constituencies. And the League ran 4 candidates in Galway for a 9-seater. Voting and counting took a long time, and they managed to secure enough transfers to get a seat. Yeah, well, 8 seats in June 1927 was a strong return for the National League. It obviously didn't mean that it was a real challenger to either Cumann na Gael or indeed to De Valera's new party, Fianna Fáil, had also been founded in 1926. For a collection of old Home Rulers to achieve wider success, certainly they needed to demonstrate new ideas or overarching policies. They were against government expenditure, which made them fiscally conservative, their policies fiscally conservative. They talked about bringing about the reunion of Ireland, but a lot of their rhetoric was anti-partitionist, but wasn't very specific about what might be done. They talked about developing education for agricultural communities, and they took a distinctive stand in opposing compulsory Irish. But even this was unpopular among some of their supporters. And they had to grapple with the fact that when a party like the Irish Party is a national movement, like the Home Rule movement is, it can be a catch-all, which is a luxury that wasn't open to a minor party in a multi-party system. In the aftermath of Kevin O'Higgins' assassination, where Fianna Fáil were effectively forced into the Dáil, the League attempted a risky coalition deal with Labour and the support of De Valera's party. This was a botched attempt that ended in failure and farce, as John Jinks failed to vote in a motion of no confidence in Cosgrave, and the League declined rapidly, folding in 1931. In a sense, then, the League was a significant example of the Irish Party's organisational legacy only. After its collapse, its members went their separate ways, and the majority did go to Cumann na Gael, but not all. Redmond, interestingly, having turned down Cumann na Gael previously, joined in November 1931. He talked about the importance of the treaty and how politics was becoming organised around the two major parties. The fall of the League, Redmond's conversion, and the rise of Fianna Fáil therefore saw the number of TDs in Cumann na Gael with Home Rule backgrounds rise. The historian Patrick Maugham is certainly correct in suggesting that the tendency to emphasise the Redmondite wing of the Irish Party in subsequent memoirs has neglected a radical element that would have been absorbed into Fianna Fáil. And of course, the Irish Party had its radical side as well. Don't forget, when we look at the leadership of Parnell's era, I mentioned some visible anti-imperialism, also, of course, the connections with Fenianism of that period. But in terms of representative politics in the period after 1922, conversions from the Home Rule movement to Fianna Fáil were notable but rare. So some of them included O'Donnell, Redmond's ally in the National League. He split with Redmond and moved towards Fianna Fáil, agreeing with De Valera's stance on the annuities question, believing, like Henry Harrison, that Britain was in the wrong. Other conversions included the ex-Galway MP James Cosgrave. Honor Crowley, born Honor Boland, was the daughter of an Irish Party MP. She married Fred Crowley, who had been active in the War of Independence, and on his passing, she succeeded him as a TD in 1945. De Valera's opponent, when he won the East Clare by-election in 1917, was Patrick Lynch. Patrick Lynch later joined Sinn Féin, opposed the treaty, and served as a Fianna Fáil senator, and would be appointed by De Valera his Attorney General in 1936. Among others in the Senate, we can include Jenny Wise Power, whose career begins in the Ladies' Land League and ends up in the Senate in that time. Yet, even as the 1932 election comes along, and politics is increasingly organised around Cumann na Gael and De Valera's new Fianna Fáil party, which is expanding rapidly and running a very good political campaign around the country, there are still others from Home Rule backgrounds who had not been assimilated into the Free State. James Dillon, who I've opened the talk with, was an individual, obviously, who was very close to the old Irish Party, the son of the last leader, and he proved resistant to appeals to join from both Cumann na Gael and Fianna Fáil. So too did Frank McDermott, also remained aloof and entered politics at this period. He was a former Irish Party activist. So in 1932, both of them contest elections as independents. Dillon draws in support of the Introitic Hibernians in Donegal. Frank McDermott draws in support of farmers in County Roscommon. And both individuals, well, they are certainly self-possessed individuals who didn't look back to the Irish Party for inspiration in all their ideas, were more forward-looking than the National League of the 1920s. They were vocal on the constitutional status of the state and can be more easily viewed in the context of the 1930s, rather than simply reusing older political labels and symbols. McDermott was unpopular in criticising the language policy and also in the policies he proposed regarding the border. McDermott argued that the state had to sacrifice some of the ideals of the Gaelic state in order to appease unionists and bring about unity. So both men used their time in the political spotlight to advocate for alternative views on the vexed questions of Irish sovereignty and unity. They entered politics, of course, as De Valera won power and began to dismantle the treaty. But for both Dillon and McDermott, what they saw as strident nationalism would only entrench partition, and participation in the Commonwealth and making concessions to British identity were crucial. In fact, they were critical of both of the major parties. McDermott criticised both Cumann na Gael and Fianna Fáil and declared, quote, "I could not bear to be in Irish politics one moment if I did not hope to see the border and partition abolished in my own lifetime." Politics in the Free State in the early 1930s, as elsewhere, became increasingly divisive. And while democracy held in the Free State, the dispute over land annuities saw increasing divisiveness both in Leinster House and around the country at political meetings and debates. The fidelity to the payments owed under land legislation won by the Irish Party was used by both Cumann na Gael and also British politicians to criticise De Valera's policy of withholding the annuities. So this is a period where Cumann na Gael run one of Michael David's sons, Robert Emmett David, as a TD, and you have senior Cumann na Gael politicians and British politicians saying the Free State government has to pay these annuities. It was the pledge made by Parnell. It was the pledge made by John Dillon, for example. However, while both sides invoked the Land League legacy, and indeed Fianna Fáil did as well, it was also the issue which propelled Dillon and McDermott to form a new party, the National Centre Party, in 1933. Dillon and McDermott founded this, absorbing along the way the remnants of the old Farmers' Union and some old Home Rulers associated with this. But it was both a party with an agrarian base of farmers, but also one which gave a platform for them to express their views on Irish nationalism and the status of the state. They argued, for example, when founding the National Centre Party, for the right to revise the treaty to allow provision to leave the Commonwealth, despite the fact that they didn't actually want that. They argued for the abolition of partition, the elimination of poverty, education of the agricultural community, an end to the Civil War party system, which was a real preoccupation of both individuals, and a commitment to build up, quote, a united Ireland founded on charity, courage, common sense, and a respect for the rights of the individual. Dillon, in fact, insisted he stood for complete sovereignty and independence and argued it could be best achieved within the structure of the Commonwealth rather than a notional republic. He envisaged cooperation with other dominions and Britain, arguing that with this, the government of Northern Ireland could be convinced to join with the Free State, and that Britain could be convinced to stop paying the subsidies, which meant, Dillon argued, it paid Northern Ireland to remain outside the Irish nation. Often, however, the speeches of Dillon and McDermott led many government campaigners to paint the Centre Party and its leaders, at any rate, as imperialists. While these ideas preoccupied both men, their fledgling party was also gaining support from cattle farmers concerned that their access to the British market was threatened by De Valera's dispute with the London government. And in the fraught period, it proved impossible for them to remain aloof from the Cumann na Gael party they criticised, but also the growing blue shirt movement headed by Eoin O'Duffy. Merger was contemplated, and eventually the subject was broached with Dillon and McDermott. And all sides apparently seem to be attracted by the idea that a merger could revitalise the opposition. And for Dillon and McDermott, they seem to have been convinced by the idea that a merger could bring politics away from the Civil War split, which they felt was poisoning politics from 1922 onwards. So we see here on the slide, on the bottom, picture of Dillon and McDermott with Eoin O'Duffy and with W.T. Cosgrave, the foundation of Fine Gael, and a picture from the Fine Gael newspaper at the time, United Ireland, which has the standing committee, along with the four in the leadership position from September 1933. And we'll note the name of the party was Fine Gael, the United Ireland Party at the time, rather than simply Fine Gael as we know it now. On an organisational level, Cumann na Gael was generous. It allowed the Centre Party and the Blue Shirts equality in appointing 6 members to its new committee. So there's equality in terms of a standing committee between Cumann na Gael, the Centre Party, and the Blue Shirt movement. The name Fine Gael, the United Ireland Party, was said to have drawn inspiration from McDermott, who wanted it to be called the United Ireland Party. And this name was used quite a lot at the time. It was only subsequently that Fine Gael became the sole name of the party. We can also see Dillon and McDermott's priorities in the heads of policy of the new party, including, quote, voluntary reunion of Ireland in a single independent state as member without any abatement of Irish sovereignty of the British Commonwealth in free and equal partnership for mutual benefit with Great Britain, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. However, their place as outsiders in the political scene was not truly changed. Along with this was a commitment to corporate ideas espoused by O'Duffy and the Blue Shirts, and the new party had to contain the increasingly erratic behaviour of its leader and of the Blue Shirt movement, and also the independent streak of farmers' movements around the country. Dillon and McDermott's rhetoric and the policy principles that they talked about didn't necessarily change, but they had to contend with O'Duffy's disastrous leadership and the fact that in the wake of his departure, the new party would simply become known and would tend to be seen as a continuation of the treatyite tradition and therefore ultimately a Sinn Féin party. The creation of Fine Gael, the United Ireland Party in 1933, therefore marked, if you like, the last point of major absorption of old home rulers into the new party politics. The United Ireland Party label quickly faded, and after the debacle of O'Duffy's leadership and after his departure, McDermott very much took a back seat in the party. He would eventually leave it over Fine Gael's response to the Abyssinia crisis. And you can see here, 22 out of 59 of its TDs at foundation had some form of home rule link, whether a prominent, like an ex-Irish Party candidate, or a prominent relative like James Dillon, or perhaps slightly less significant links, whether they had been formerly councillors or guardians affiliated with the United Irish League, or they had some background in the OH. And similarly, we see connections from 1937, 38, 43, and 44. Dillon remained among them until his stance on neutrality, and he remained a significant, if distinctive, voice in Fine Gael. He took part, for example, in the Empire Parliamentary Association. Both he and McDermott remained committed to situating debate about whether the state should be a republic or whether it should still be in the Commonwealth. But by 1935, Dillon admitted that he and McDermott probably could not bring everyone in the ranks of the party with them. So between 1933 and up to 1948, between 25 and 35% of Fine Gael's TDs had traceable home rule roots, but conversely, a distinct home rule identity faded from everyday politics. In fact, it can be argued that Fianna Fáil shared more characteristics with the Irish Party, despite attracting few converts in comparison to Fine Gael, at least in some ways. Richard Dunphy has written how De Valera took up the Irish tradition of identifying party with nation, as indeed Sinn Féin had done previously. This success helped to establish Fianna Fáil as a mass nationalist movement, which had echoes of pre-treaty Sinn Féin and the Irish Party. As it found its feet in Dáil Éireann, it even engaged in obstructionism in 1928, not necessarily actively nodding to Parnell and Joseph Biggar, but nonetheless engaging in a similar tactic. De Valera instituted strict discipline and a strong whip system, something upon which the Irish Party had prided itself. Its party pledge resembled very closely that of Parnell's party. Mel Farrell has shown that Cumann na Gael sought to echo the inclusiveness of the Irish Party in its selection conventions and in its organisation, but it was ultimately not as effective. Well, Fianna Fáil proved to be a marvel, particularly after getting into power. Fianna Fáil's organisation seemed to far outstrip that of Fine Gael, and both within Parliament and also around the country. Interestingly, and I say this interestingly, given a lot of the discourse between the Irish Party and Sinn Féin prior to the First World War, particularly at local government level in Dublin, as Kieran Wallace has showed, was about Sinn Féin members often saying that home rulers at local level were engaged in jobbery and preferment, and these accusations were thrown at Fianna Fáil during its long period in power. There was perhaps irony, therefore, that it was James Dillon and not Arthur Griffith or indeed William O'Brien who was condemning instances of government supporters in a self-governed Ireland prospering due to political allegiances, while veterans of the revolution sought to defend a new dominant nationalist party. If we look then towards the late 1930s, and we look at the institution of the new constitution, Bunreacht na hÉireann, and which sees the name of the state changed to Éire from the Irish, we move into this period between, at least in terms of terminology, between the Free State and before the Republic is declared. Home rulers respond to some of the events of this period, including the Second World War, in different ways. McDermott was prominent in putting down amendments to De Valera's constitution. He again reiterated his principles like the benefits of Commonwealth membership. He opposed Irish being declared the first language of the state. He opposed the special position accorded to the Catholic Church. He also sparked a debate in the Senate when he joined in McDermott in 1938, where in response to his question, De Valera admitted he would not be prepared to sacrifice the tricolour and other symbols of nationalism to appeal to unionists and secure unification. However, these changes went by without much remark from others who might be associated with the Home Rule movement, and still others were prominent in ways that reflected different concerns and new political realities. For example, Mary Sheehy Kettle and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington from Home Rule family were prominent, but they opposed the clauses in the Constitution concerning women's rights. And outside of Parliament too, other individuals reflected individual concerns, albeit they may have stood out as distinctive from not being part of a Sinn Féin background. Henry Harrison mentioned, published Ulster and the British Empire in 1939, in which he blamed British intrigue for partition. He attributed it to difficulties in Anglo-Irish relations, and therefore argued it was a danger to the security and stability not just of Anglo-Irish relations, but the empire. While he declared himself well disposed to the Commonwealth, he was scathing in his criticism of the British government and its policy in Ireland. In truth, by the 1930s, the nationalism of the pre-rising Redmondite Party looked very different to that was then espoused by Fianna Fáil, or arguably any other party in independent Ireland. The strength of the connection between the attitudes of Dillon and McDermott to Ireland's neutrality from 1939, and both men's roots in a party which had adopted support for the British war effort in 1914, remains topic of conversation. However, while both Dillon and McDermott ultimately declared in favour of De Valera adopting a similar policy to that which John Redmond had in the First World War, Dillon in particular situated his opinions in the contemporary context. He didn't refer back to the Irish Party. In fact, while Redmond had supported enlistment in the British Army, John Dillon had held quite aloof from that during the First World War. And in the Second World War, James Dillon's advocacy for entering the war was couched in terms of responsibilities to what he said was Ireland's historic ally, the United States, and the necessity to defeat Nazism. And I think we can argue, if we think of the work of Deirdre McMahon, that perhaps the legacy of Redmond and the example of Redmond's actions during the First World War exercised a heavier influence on De Valera as he dealt with British invitations to enter the war and the possibility of unity as a carrot in order for an Irish entry into the Second World War. Despite then the statistics on the slide here about Home Rule backgrounds of Fine Gael TDs, which wasn't replicated if we look at the backgrounds of Fianna Fáil TDs in this period, the political heritage of people like Dillon, well, he's in Fine Gael, obviously he leaves due to his opposition to neutrality, and also Bridget Redmond, who succeeded her husband William Redmond in 1933, only really arose when historical events were under discussion. Well, at the remove of decades, we should of course be careful not to read too much into the motivations of self-possessed public representatives. Dillon and the Cork Examiner, as Irish Party defenders, resented the focus on the earlier Irish Party and land war, and the land war in commemorations of Parnell and Davitt in the 1940s. So Parnell and Davitt are commemorated in 1941 and 1946, but the emphasis in this era of Fianna Fáil dominance is very much on the Irish Party of the land war period. So the stamp here in 1946 depicts the Land League movement and the land war. It has the names of Parnell and Davitt on it. And De Valera himself speaks at commemorations to Parnell and Davitt. They're not given state commemorations, but they are, if you like, elevated higher than Redmond was and than what the later Irish Party was. In some ways, this echoes Sinn Féin material from 1918, where Sinn Féin in 1918 attacked John Dillon and the party of Redmond, if you like, and their policies during the First World War, but Sinn Féin had not attacked the era of Parnell or Davitt. It had actually portrayed the Irish Party of 1918 as betraying that earlier period. And this view of the Irish Party seemed to take hold in the 1930s and 40s, and it was something that Dillon and the Cork Examiner resisted. Redmond's memory therefore suffered in comparison to Parnell or Davitt, and tributes to the later Irish Party of Redmond were fleeting, usually like the appreciative nods that TDs made in response to Dillon when he appealed for aid for Irish Party veterans who were elderly and in need of aid in this period. Tributes were ephemeral in their impact, and they certainly weren't enough to bring Redmond and the later Irish Party back to the forefront of collective memory. There was little Home Rule tinge to the inter-party government in 1948, despite the fact that it contained almost all old links to the Irish Party. So we see here individuals with any kind of Home Rule background, from the prominence of being an ex-MP to more tenuous links were almost all contained in Fine Gael or in the independent benches, like Dillon, like Alfie Byrne and Alfie Byrne's son. There was little home rule tinge, though, despite this, and the fact that David McCullough has written that John A. Costello was a home ruler in his youth. If we think of what the inter-party government did, perhaps one of the most significant things that we remember the inter-party government for, though, is the Declaration of the Republic and the exit from the Commonwealth. And as Kate O'Malley has pointed out in her study of Ireland and India, De Valera had been reluctant to declare a republic or leave the Commonwealth because of partition. Yet those who had home rule backgrounds were generally able to swallow the constitutional changes of 1948 to 49 relatively easily, in public at least. Alfie Byrne did receive correspondence from supporters who were upset about it, and his son Alfred did move an amendment in the Dáil against the Republic of Ireland bill, believing that its enactment would impair the chances of unity. Alfie Byrne himself said that he stood for a 32-county United Ireland and asked if people believed unity was possible in 1912, why wouldn't they when there was a Labour Party government in Britain? However, James Dillon, so often vocal on this issue, recorded his support for the bill and then went to an agricultural conference in the United States. Bridget Redmond, seen here, spoke at the time, and she admitted that she had been in favour of Commonwealth membership, but argued that as the state had, quote, neither been in the Commonwealth nor really outside it for the past few years, a reference to the constitutional arrangement existing prior to that, she welcomed the end of what she called hypocrisy and the constitutional clarity brought around by declaring a republic. The former MP, who's noted on the slide previously, John Limbrick Esmond, merely declared himself as one who had entered politics as an Irish Party MP in 1915 to be glad to have seen this day. Outside of Parliament, some remained unconvinced. J.J. Horgan in Cork was a former Redmondite who was Ireland correspondent for the Commonwealth Journal, The Round Table, and he had previously been very positive about Dillon, but he acerbically turned on him for his not opposing this move. Henry Harrison too opposed the move, and he wrote to the historian Nicholas Manzer, expressing unhappiness that the declaration of a republic entailed a Commonwealth exit. He at that point was president of a branch of the Anti-Partition League in Paddington, in Britain, and he argued that an indispensable amendment be added to the Ireland Bill, that the people of Northern Ireland would decide if it left the United Kingdom rather than the storm on Parliament. And of course, it is interesting that subsequent to this, India declared a republic but stayed part of the Commonwealth, if you think of the conversation between Harrison and Manzer. However, for many others with Home Rule links, politics was now in a very different era, and this showed much less unease at the changes of this period. So if we come to look towards a conclusion, personal legacies of the Irish Party were therefore multiple, and there were many ways, of course, in which the party influenced independent Ireland. Maurice Manning has said the Irish Party familiarised generations with the working of parliamentary institutions, showed how real achievements could be made through Parliament, in a sense socialised the vast majority into seeing Parliament as the normal forum for the working out of democracy. And Irish Party leaders like John Dillon might be forgiven a rueful thought at this statement, that the idea that the work of the party had helped to forge a political culture which was then used against them in 1918. But I think drawing on what Manning has said, it can be said that the Irish Party did play an integral role in developing a political culture, a set of beliefs surrounding politics, and a set of norms which govern political behaviour. The Free State period was nevertheless a different context for followers and their families to navigate. They weren't shut out of Irish life. James McConnell has shown that in the case of the children of Irish Party MPs, that they often played prominent roles in business and law as well as politics. Organisations like the AOH, particularly along the border, helped to maintain connections between old members and even across the border, albeit their activism did little to undermine the reality of partition. And in the 1920s, the Irish Party was very prominent, with its members entering politics, affecting the composition of political groupings. In fact, the roots of the Irish Party helped to form a model for all parties, not just Sinn Féin. The opinions of individuals who did stand out, like Dillon and McDermott, who clung to older ideas and clung to distinctive beliefs, helped to illuminate debates on the state's passage from Free State to Republic. the complications surrounding the Commonwealth, exiting the Commonwealth, even indicate some similarities in thinking between De Valera and McDermott in the importance of weighing sovereignty and unity. However, while their enthusiasm for the Commonwealth was a minority taste, politicians from Sinn Féin backgrounds, of course, later used for a like the League of Nations, the UN or the European Community to promote Ireland on the world scale. The initiatives of former Home Rulers in forming the Centre Party and later Fine Gael, of course, also helped, however unintentionally, to shape the cleavage between the two major parties in the state. It could be said, as Mel Farrell and others have looked at, that in the 1930s, the development of politics actually helped set the tone for what we often call Civil War politics. A lot of the assumptions and a lot of the stereotypes associated with Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil date to that 1930s period as much as they date to the Free State, to the Civil War period of the early 1920s. It could be argued that a Redmondite tinge and the connections, both prominent like Dillon and Redmond, and also the other connections that I've outlined on the slides, was uncomfortable for Fine Gael, that it influenced opinions of the old party, of both the Irish Party and Fine Gael itself, problematising Fine Gael's image as the party of Collins and Griffith. It's also ironic that Fianna Fáil absorbed far fewer politicians from Irish Party backgrounds, but resembled it more closely, as De Valera attained a level of respect and obedience akin to Parnell, while the party's discipline in Parliament, interest in local issues, and ability to construct durable constituency networks within a national movement had an appearance of the formidable Irish Party machine far more than its Fine Gael opponent did in the 1930s and 40s. However, after the formation of Fine Gael, any distinct Irish Party identity ceased to exist in politics. And for those whose names or support bases were still associated with the Irish Party, contemporary politics sometimes entailed the kind of awkward situation that Redmond and Dillon encountered when endorsing the Republic. Yet, the Irish Party never really needed to be reclaimed from the ether either. In addition to its role in developing the parliamentary tradition in the country, the proliferation of commemoration events to Redmond, Parnell and Davitt, the presence of former Irish Party members in politics and the way they influenced politics demonstrated the shadow of the party over Irish life. It was sometimes an uncomfortable shadow. It was sometimes a dubious inheritance for those entering politics from home rule backgrounds. However, their very presence, I think, sheds light on the continuities between pre- and post-independence Ireland, underlining the very real influence the party had on those that succeeded it, and the tenacity of certain modes of thinking and ideas of identity. The relationship between the Irish Party and the later parties in debates about public memory and history were often difficult, but the debates fostered and developed in the 1920s, 30s and 40s clearly belie the more extreme notions of John Redmond and the party that he led, that they were so completely forgotten in the new state, but also the alternative view that they were so readily rehabilitated, they could easily retake their place at the forefront of the Irish political establishment. Thanks very much.
Thanks a million, Martin, for an absolutely fascinating lecture. If anyone has any questions, they can just pop them into the chat box and I'll ask a couple to Martin. Martin, I've one there myself. Is John Redmond's legacy, when you compare it to other people you mentioned, like Davitt and Parnell, is it somewhat overshadowed or even tainted by his position on Irishmen serving in the British Army during World War I, or his, I suppose, desire really to have Ireland remain a central figure in the British Empire? What's your opinion on his legacy?
Thanks very much. I think there's a couple of things to note. I think in the period that I was looking at, his memory did suffer in comparison to Parnell and Davitt and others, and it suffered for a few reasons. I think it suffered, yes, the influence of calling an Irishman to enlist in the British Army was there, and certainly the pro-imperial statements that he made and that he was associated with. But I also think that there was an effort at that time to, or not so much an effort, but a tendency to consider Redmond and the later Irish Party as weak. The Irish Party, let's say in its latter years, was associated with being outfoxed by British politicians, particularly on the issue of the exclusion of Ulster counties from home rule proposals. There was a tendency that they had become, if we look at Redmond's rhetoric, more pro-British, that they were outsmarted by unionist politicians, by British politicians, and that really Sinn Féin was the new broom which had swept clean. And obviously, whether somebody was from a Fine Gael background or Fianna Fáil background, they saw it that way. I think there was also very much in De Valera speeches at the commemorations and in the Irish press in this period, articles that suggested, well, that actually Sinn Féin was the real successors of Parnell and the Irish Parliamentary Party. Some of the articles at this time around Parnell talked about Parnell bringing the war to Westminster. So if you like, reshaping the development of the Irish Party and saying that this early Irish Party was associated with the land war, was associated with that period. It brought the war to Westminster, which of course called to mind, the association with Fenianism, which I mentioned, which was brought out when William O'Brien passed away as well. So there was a tendency in that period then to very much see that, I'm going to badly paraphrase De Valera here from one of the speeches, but I don't have the quote in front of me, but he talked about the way that the volunteers and Sinn Féin marched on the shoulders of the Land League generation. So that kind of narrative of history therefore leaves out the later Irish Party of John Redmond. And I think that was a view that was quite general at that time. And that was what James Dillon resented, and that's what the Cork Examiner actually resented in some of its editorials. They argued, well, Parnell was always only and ever a constitutionalist, the same as Redmond and the same as the successors. I suppose the second point I'd make, though, more generally about Redmond is that was in the 1930s and 40s, and I think at other times Redmond has been remembered and recalled. I didn't mention there because I was coming up to the Republic, but the centenary of his birth in 1956 saw events held in Wexford. De Valera attended, and in his capacity as the Chancellor of the National University of Ireland, he was leader of the opposition at that time. Historians came and spoke, so there was a strong commemoration there, albeit it was held in Wexford, not in Dublin. In terms of scholarly attention, certainly the Parnell and Davitt in that era did receive more attention for quite a time, and it's often pointed out that there was no biography of Redmond between 1932 with the Dennis Gwynn book and then Paul Bew's book in 1996. But since then, there's been a lot of attention on Redmond, I think, in the last 25 years. Dermot Malidi has completed works. Joseph Finan, Alvin Jackson did a dual biography of Redmond and Carson, and the Decade of Centenaries has really brought Redmond to the fore. Not always without controversy. The banner of the parliamentary leaders outside College Green was daubed, I think, coming up to Centenary of the Rising. But it certainly feels as though Redmond and the Irish Party were very much brought into the forefront, I think, in the last few years of commemorations.
Thanks, Martin. I have a question there from Liam Shortle. I wonder why Redmond chose not to join the War Cabinet in contrast to Carson, but yet recommended serving in the British Army.
Yeah, that's one of the dilemmas that Redmond faced in this period, the issue of the cabinet. He defended the decision to serve in the British Army on a couple of grounds. He defended it on, first of all, the view that they were fighting on the right side, and he very much talked up Catholic Belgium. And you think of that war poster where Redmond is sort of in the position of Kitchener, calling on people to enlist because of what's the attacks on Catholic Belgium and that rhetoric. He also talked about the idea, though, that Home Rule was on the statute books and that Ireland would always play a role with, again, his view of Ireland playing a role within the British Empire once Home Rule had been achieved. But he also did talk about tactics. And it was in that context that the Ulster Volunteers were going to serve, that Unionists were going to serve, and that there was a tactical benefit, obviously, to nationalists fighting in the British Army, not knowing initially, I think, and like a lot of others, are not realising just what kind of war it was going to be. The War Cabinet is a slightly different one, although it's a very important issue over the course of the war, in that Redmond had a decision to make, and his decision was based on the idea that no nationalist politician was going to serve before Home Rule was actually enacted. So he's in this in-between space where Home Rule is on the statute books, but Home Rule is not enacted. So in some respects in this period, Redmond he almost seems to have responsibility but not authority. And he didn't want to serve in cabinet as an Irish nationalist in a British cabinet when there was no Home Rule or self-government in Ireland. It was something of a dilemma because the dynamics of the British government in Ireland changed so dramatically during the war, where you've gone from a Liberal government before the war that's reliant on nationalist votes to govern, when you then have a wartime coalition. So you have Conservatives in government with the Liberals, and then you have Carson serving in cabinet. It very much changes the dynamic. And I think in terms of, for many people in Ireland, I think if you look at some of the local newspapers at that time, there's very much a sense to which Home Rule keeps getting delayed. I think a lot of people are as concerned with Home Rule getting on statute books initially, when Redmond first offers that volunteers are going to defend the shores of Ireland. And the dynamic is very different to think that there's a Conservative, Liberal, wartime coalition with Carson at the cabinet table compared to what it had been before 1914. So I think those changes were very damaging for Redmond, and damaging in terms of how much people actually trusted the British government.
Thanks, Martin. Just a comment in there from Owen O'Shea. Thanks very much for an informative book. The book is excellent. It fills a void in the political history of the period, which I think I'd agree with. And
thanks very much.
You mentioned, Martin, that the book is now available in paperback. Where can people actually purchase the book if they want to get it?
It can be purchased directly from the Liverpool University Press website. There's a hardback available. I say the paperback is more reasonably priced. So it's available, I think, as of now, or it should be available more or less now, to order from the website. And then I know it's due out this month, so it's just a matter of when it gets distributed to shops anyway. So I can't say that for sure, but it's certainly available to order online anyway, in the paperback form, and hopefully in all good shops soon, as the line goes.
Great. Thanks so much, Martin. A brilliant lecture. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. Again, it's a period of Irish history I wasn't familiar with, and there's a lot of complimentary comments coming in here in the chat. A lot of people enjoyed the lecture. Thanks so much for joining us this evening and sharing your knowledge. We really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for logging in and joining us.
Okay. Bye all.
Thanks.